But next up is our Sustainable Data Centre Forum. So let me go through our guests. We have David Watkins, Solutions Director at VIRTUS, Stephen Brown, Global Segment Director at Schneider Electric, Susanna Cass, Data Centre Advisor, Head of Sustainability at Infraprime, and we also have with us Ali Moinadin, Managing Director Europe and Chief Corporate Development Officer at Uptime Institute. Welcome to all of you and welcome to Data Centre Live London.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Very welcome
Hello.
Indeed. Right. We've a lot to get through, so we'll crack straight into it if we can. We're talking how data centre operators have got a duty to reduce their environmental impacts, which is leading them down more sustainable paths to decarbonisation, construction and operation of facilities. So we're understanding the capabilities of legacy technologies and how that's key to making the transition to more climate-friendly offerings. We could talk all afternoon about this, but we're going to try and keep it to half an hour or so. Let's start with a lovely open question, and that's how important the design and build of a data centre is to sustainability. And as you are first on my list, David, I'll begin with you.
Critical, especially as we look further than efficiency now and really start to get into things like embedded carbon. I think the industry is well versed in the design and build sustainability options now. All of us operate and build efficient data centres, but now it's becoming more about the entire life cycle, so embedded carbon during the build phase, making sure that the manufacturing of the equipment we use is sustainable and we source it locally as far as we can.
Susanna? Susanna, can you hear me? I can't hear Suzanne, so Stephen, I'll go to you with the same question.
Sure. Well, I mean, I have to agree with David, of course, on this. Design and build is becoming critical to how sustainable our data centers are. We've done fairly well as an industry in procuring green energy. So unless you're a very legacy data center running very inefficiently, typically you're going to find that most of your embodied carbon over the life cycle is in that design and build phase, which is a challenge. And so that starts to beg questions around traceability, the digital tools that we have to make those trade-offs during the design process, the ability we collaborate across the fragmented ecosystem, because it's really hard across the many different stakeholders and incentives to target embodied carbon. And that's where it's really going to come down to how can we effectively deploy and use digital tools for design and construction, where you can trade off cost, time, and carbon, make decisions around what type of concrete or steel or products you're going to pull into your environment, which is a bit of a challenge. But the thing that I'm optimistic on is that there's also a business incentive to deploy that kind of technology and design and build. The construction segment over the last 20 years, according to McKinsey, has only increased productivity by 1%, when the rest of the economy has been close to 3%. So you can kind of kill two birds with one stone, where let's adopt the kind of technology and transparency and collaboration so that we can make those real-time carbon trade-off decisions, which will also help us have better construction outcomes in the data center segment. So it's an absolute imperative.
Susanna, I'll try to come back to you next on this one. I'm not sure if there was a problem with your microphone. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Sorry about that. My response to that is be very concise. There's 4 pillars that we need to consider during the design and build that encompasses the life cycle. We all are quite familiar now with renewable energy and the clean energy transition. So we need to plan that in the specification and the design, also incorporating renewable fuel above and beyond the energy mix. Second, the practices that we do need to embrace more metrics and evidence in terms of a sustainability practice throughout the entire life cycle, not just the build and the design, but also include the operation, which oftentimes does the most emission, and also think ahead what happened when we actually have to decommission or we have to scale up. So some of the practice that I've been working on right now is actually design for disassembly before we even think about building it in the first place. And we need to think about emissions throughout the life cycle, not just in the fence, but also embracing the entire supply responsibility So the materials are quite important in terms of where we source, where we come from, what are we going to do with it after we complete it in the data center in terms of creating a value and a reuse cycle. So all of that, I agree with Stephen, need to be evidence-based, and we need to codify all of them. And I invented this concept called a digital passport, so we can keep track of every connectors, every material, so we know about the life cycle, and we are responsible, according to the UN SDG goal, of a responsible consumption and production throughout the entire life cycle.
Susanna, that's a great idea. Ali, I'll come to you last on this.
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything the panelists are saying. You know, practically speaking, as the Global Data Center Authority, what we're seeing is a shift in the approach by a lot of organizations in terms of, you know, the architectural choices of their data centers, which are, you know, driven by the component placement as well as the configuration. We are seeing, you know, more choices around technology, which are, you know, driving efficiencies such as, you know, water cooling within data centers, which is being reintroduced. We are also seeing organizations taking much more interest around energy reuse and the heat reuse of their infrastructure itself, and particularly, as Susanna says, a much more focus on not just the data center infrastructure itself, but also the utilization of the IT within that infrastructure, and particularly around, you know, driving efficiencies in terms of the output per watt used in terms of IT compute. So, you know, a much more joined up approach to not just, you know, thinking about, you know, the metrics that everybody talks about. I know there's a question about it later on, so I won't go into that. But yeah, really looking at the actual environmental impact of the infrastructure from the day that it's commissioned all the way to end of life.
Because one thing we need to touch on is looking at legacy technologies, some of the technology that's still out there in the market that might be installed in different places. I'll open this up to all of you. What are the common problems with that, the common mistakes that exist in that legacy technology when put into the modern context? I'll open that up to all of you.
I mean, maybe if I may, a data center, life cycle, 15 to 20 years before perhaps it requires an upgrade. But at the time of building and commissioning the data center, most operators were making choices about optimizing that infrastructure, either as an enterprise or a service provider, to be the most cost-effective solution in order to provide a resilient infrastructure. Today, it's about resiliency and sustainable infrastructure itself. So as opposed to mistakes, technology moves on. So organizations do have to look at what the current technology is and how that can be applied in the modern context. So what we're seeing is a lot of the hard work around sustainability has been done on the M&E side of the equation for data centers, but there's a significant amount of upside in terms of sustainability if organizations really focus on the IT side of the sustainability, as well as Susan mentioned, about really thinking about the embedded carbon and Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions.
And I'll just follow up with that in that I think we're still a little hamstrung by our inability to track at scale kind of Scope 3 today, because it makes it hard to understand the impact of switching out a legacy asset for something perhaps more efficient. when the trade-off is that you've just, brought in more embodied carbon effectively. So there's that old adage that, whatever the most efficient vehicle to drive is the one you're driving today because, the embodied carbon of replacing no matter how efficient. Now, that's not strictly true in vehicles or in data centers. There are definitely times when it's well worth it to upgrade and become more efficient, bring in even simple things that you should be doing anyway, aisle containment, optimizing the airflow, depending on what sort of abilities you have to influence the white space. But it is something around legacy infrastructure that we need to think about, is both the impact of extending the life of that asset through modernization, through digital services so that you can understand the health in real time. Many times that will be more effective than simply replacing it with a more efficient structure or data center overall.
David?
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I think the other opportunity with legacy equipment is bringing more of the circular economy into the equation. So we've got an example of this in one of our oldest data centre now, which is over 10 years old. Typically, we might think to replace chillers and the like at this stage to get those efficiency gains. However, what we're actually doing is we're doing it, but in the body of the existing chiller. So the coils are coming out, we're putting newer ones in, we're putting more efficient pumps in, etc. So to Stephen's point, we're not bringing in that extra level of embodied carbon, but we're making what we've got more efficient, which I think is going to become increasingly prevalent as we move forward.
Susanna?
Well, yes, thank you for all the wonderful advice that each of the panelists shared. They are absolutely very insightful. I would say the only new point that I would add, so I don't repeat what was already shared, is actually focusing a little bit more on legacy application. I call that the long tail. Some of the applications of some of the customers will never go away. So in a lot of ways that in data center, we're still going to support them. But just like children, we love them all equally, but differently. So when we plan about the legacy application, they are not as the same as some of the newer applications, such as more AI generative application or ChatGPT like. We need to support them differently. Specifically, what we can change from an architecture in operation is we will zap those zombie servers, because oftentimes they're not basically used that often, or they don't need to be supported in that regard. So we need to start thinking about the resources dedicated to these legacy application can be wind down. And oftentimes they're not being used as often as some of the more demanding applications. So hence, we reduce significantly on that down to 0.05 from an architecture compared to 1, or hope like now, no one is actually doing a 2N architecture instead of having idle resources. So in that regard, when you add it all up from an aggregate perspective on a data center, these are very important. Or we streamline then and we reduce the architecture. Do we really need to have all of those legacy applications in each of our availability zone? The answer is absolutely not, because we have a lot of analytics to identify where to access and what is the most efficient way to support these applications and optimize it. And by doing so, we have done some of them recently for one of our clients. We were able to reduce as much as 65% of all the resources live in the original architecture. And to Stephen's point, the reason why we can actually do that, because we have all the metrics that we were keeping track of it throughout the life cycle. Hence, we were able to keep the uptime, just like what Ali does very well in his organization, and still comply with that. But we treat them differently for the legacy applications and the legacy architecture. And for any of you who might be interested in what we have done, we are very, very glad to share. In that way, we can also help you solve your problem, and you can continue to help us to solve ours.
The next thing I want to get into is about the renewable energy transition. It's a huge part of the picture. For you, Is that transition happening quickly enough, and what can be done to keep accelerating that change?
I think as an industry, we're very much driving that transition. All of us would like to have a decarbonised grid in country, but there aren't any currently, as far as I'm aware, around the world. So when the sun stops shining and it's not windy anymore, we're going to be using other sources of energy generation to provide what we need. But if you look across the big hyperscalers, they're all signing huge quantities of PPA agreements. Microsoft have got 6 gigawatts in 10 countries. AWS are the biggest purchaser of renewable energy globally. We've been using renewable energy within our business since 2012, and on average, we're probably saving about 50 million tonnes of carbon every year by doing so. And the investment in this, in the renewable generation that a lot of companies are doing now, is driving the increased availability of renewable energy in country. And I it's something that we probably don't stress enough as an industry, and educate other people as it being the way to go forward.
Just to comment on, follow up on Dave's comment around the purchasing size of the hyperscalers. I mean, it's very clear the top 4 hyperscalers are within the top 6 of all renewable energy purchasers. For power purchase agreements, they were in 21, I think, according to Bloomberg, in the 30% of all power purchase agreements, which is incredible. And to their credit, they're fairly transparent about what's actually displacing non-green energy versus just hoovering up existing capacity, which is a really important step, because you can't just dump a lot of green energy on the grid if it's not actually incremental to what's going on out there. I think the next step to this is, in terms of, are we as an industry driving the renewable energy transition, is to look at the whole value chain, the leasing partners, co-location, build-to-suit. What flexibility do they have to innovate where they need to reduce consumption, and also take steps towards really creative use of renewable energy, whether it's on-site generation, grid interactivity, microgrid. There's a lot of opportunities that are kind of left out for some of our industry, based on really important SLAs and standards and reinforcement and competition and everything. There are great reasons for it, but I think we need to start having a more open conversations that, yes, as an industry, we're definitely among the top tier leading renewable energy transition in operations. Let's just go a little bit deeper and challenge ourselves to say, what can we do more, knowing the unique characteristics of our value chain to drive renewables?
Certainly, if I may, that's largely, as you were saying, driven by the SLA commitments and the requirements from the end clients, as provided as far as the service providers are concerned. Again, what we're seeing is a shift from the enterprise segment, who historically were looking at the SLAs and saying, well, this is what we've had for the last 5-10 years, and this is the way we want to be supported in the future. So as opposed to, leading edge, they've been at the bleeding edge side of things. But now most of these enterprises, have set their carbon reduction goals. They've set their net zero ambitions. They've made that public. So they're now driving that down into the service provider sector. And I think they're being much more pragmatic and practical on how, as a end-to-end user of, as a user of technology, but also service partners, how do they really look at the energy footprint across their portfolio? So that, I think, will drive further innovation in our sector.
Yes, and I'd like to add with some metrics to everything that the speakers share, which is very excellent insight. Over 60 gigawatt was procured just in the last year, in spite of all the geopolitical uncertainty and the market uncertainty that take place. And what is encouraging to hear is data center, similar to what the speakers just shared, are spearheaded and did our share. And AWS didn't start from the beginning, but they're definitely one of the largest energy procurement and move up their commitment to 2025 from 2030. So that is extremely inspiring and ambitious, working with this client. In addition to, of course, followed by the early pioneers such as Google, Microsoft, Meta, Apple, and so on and so forth, like a Salesforce.com. So this is very encouraging that we stay bullish in doing the clean energy transition. But when I look at the report in more detail and every deal relating to the 64 gigawatt, which, by the way, to the audience, we are very transparent about sharing that. So any of you interested in that, we can actually make that report available. So you see every one of the transactions that make up the 64 gigawatt. Just contact Sustainability Live, and I'll make sure they share with you the report. It goes beyond actually the data center sector. Many of the enterprises, the manufacturing company, the consumer company, and you see in many countries above and beyond the leading one that you would expect, also participated. So in my small vantage view, it is extremely encouraging that the voice by the leaders over here have been heard. They are now being executed. Are we there yet? The answer is no, because studying the carbon pledge that most of the company all have done, Susanna wasn't really satisfied with this answer. Only 17% of the company making these carbon pledge to transition to clean energy have a written plan. So it's sort of like, I want to get healthy, but I don't have a plan to have an exercise or how am I going to change my diet. It's not going to get you there by 2030 or 2040. So there's still quite a bit of work to do. But I have to believe that actually there's a lot of progress in the last 12 months. And I think we need to pick it up. And this is why we're having this conference to talk about it, to share some experiences. And I do hope one day we don't need to even have a conference about sustainability because we're already doing it.
Absolutely. Susanna, I'll come back to you first with this question, as we are sticking with sustainability here and it being a priority. Do you see there any risk of it being a sticking point for investors in the future because sustainability is so high on the agenda?
Repeat the question one more time, sorry. Do I see...
Yeah, with sustainability being such a priority, do you think that will be a sticking point for any investors in the future?
No, quite the contrary, actually. I believe currently now, most of the investment folks are awakened to realize that double bottom line and triple bottom line is actually going to keep them sustainable. So this is not about just improving the financial statement. That's the easy part. That's where you all gentlemen has been leading from the beginning. And now you allow some of us women in here and some of the other community getting involved. So our little thoughts are being shared and embedded that it need to have a social cost of responsibility from an investment. I actually think most of the leading pioneer in the investment area are actually taking sustainability very seriously, especially the EU 27 has come up with the environmental directive. So they want to make sure they package up their portfolio company that they also have the high literacy about sustainability and what the impact it is to, first of all, savings that Ali talked about just makes a lot of sense, and be able to create value creation out from the waste of the data center. So now you can do district heating and cooling without actually using extra energy, just common sense. And hopefully we're all going to continue to do that and follow Stephen's lead on using the metrics that his company came up with, a phenomenal dashboard that I actually use, and some of the very strategic insight that Dave kicked us off in our panel. So it is about collaboration. However, if one look at that, just try to solve the problem, you're not going to get there. I think the only way we get there is we all collaborate and work together so we have the best of breed to ensure that sustainability is in the agenda. Maybe not number one, but definitely top three.
I'll go to you, Ali, next on this one. Do you see it potentially as a sticking point for some investors, or is it a massive selling point?
I mean, certainly what we see as an organization on a global basis, ESG, specifically environmental social governance, is a high priority for investors in the investments that they're making, whether they're VC or debt financing. There has been some debate and discussions in North America around these ESG funds and the level of due diligence that they have been doing on their investments. But certainly, as we can see from the global regulations that are in effect, that there is specific directives around, reporting on ESG related initiatives, and particularly on environmental and social impact of some of the larger scale ICT infrastructures that have been deployed globally. As organizations with working with over 2,500 enterprises globally, what we see is that they are also making strategic investments and choosing partners based on their ESG credentials, right? And that is because they have made public commitments. They report the metrics in their annual filings, and certainly investors, whether you are as I say a debt financing VC or a pension fund, are looking at the environmental impact of the infrastructure organizations are running. So if you can prove through the metrics, through evidence, as Susanna's highlighted, then I think you're in a good position to attract investment.
David?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with everything that the guys have said previously. I think now it's important that a lot of investment funds actually offer sustainable products. If you invest in your own money now, it's become a feature. Back in the day, it would always just be about how much money you're going to get back, what return you're going to get. But now people, there's a level of ethics involved in investing. And I know we get asked questions by customers, for example, not just about our own ESG, but also about the ESG of our supply chain. So it goes all the way through. And I actually think to have and the most important point, as the guys have said previously, you need to be able to evidence what you're doing. So not as well as talking the talk, you've got to be able to prove it. And if you can do that, then it should not be a barrier to investment.
Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, Dave mentioned one really important thing, which is our ability. I mean, many important things, but one of those many was the ability to invest now in ESG funds. And I think even the flip side of that is we saw an explosion of sustainability-linked loans or debt for the data center industry. Co-location providers were taking up billions of dollars in debt that where now pieces of that are contingencies around KPIs and showing that you're sustainable and hitting targets and having science-based targets to begin with. And so it's a really important piece that we've seen that. So that means that those metrics are out there, they exist, people are trying to hit them. I think my one cautious piece to this is just that we haven't seen that holistic alignment on what's that investment criteria, how well have they gotten that at pricing embodied carbon into sort of their end-of-life assets, their circularity, all those things that do take a level of investment. Are they really taking that into account? And so I think that's a fair ask, is more transparency from the investment community in terms of, is there alignment around what quantifies as a ESG fund? And then the fair response from them to ask us in the data center industry is, well, can you give me a coherent set of metrics, alignment around what is the sustainable data center? It's clearly not just PUE, among many others. So I think it's a back and forth in a discussion, but I am optimistic still, despite my one caveat, because of the level of attention that this topic gets. As Susanna and others have just pointed out, it's every conference we're actually having real substantial conversations around it, tough conversations around pricing and how do you put this in requests for proposals to vendors. We're starting to see that cascade down in terms of what is the carbon footprint of your supply chain, so I can put it in the my supply chain. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I just want to move faster towards alignment on really how are we valuing these activities.
Well, I'm going to jump to some of our audience questions very quickly. We've got a very good one here about the regulation situation at the moment. This is from Steffi Singh. Thank you, Steffi. Has the regulatory framework been sufficiently established by governments and implemented by companies to support and enforce sustainable development initiatives? Where are we on the regulatory framework at the moment? I'll open this up to all of you.
I think there are well-established reported metrics within the industry now, a lot of which is compulsory. So again, everyone's got an ESG plan, they've got a goal to hit. It's very rigorous. You've got to publish your emissions. It goes to the Environment Agency. There's a lot more permitting required now for things like standby generators, even though we very rarely use them. But I think the most important thing is engagement rather than regulation, because data centers as an industry are relatively new in the grand scheme of things. And what we really need to do is educate and help governments be able to regulate correctly, because if you don't, regulation will happen anyway, and it can get quite difficult and quite painful. So it's good there, the relationships with industry trade bodies like, for example, Tech UK, enable the industry to get visibility and direct contact at government level. And all of that is helping, because ultimately, as large energy consumers, we're here to not just to do the right thing for sustainability, we're here to support government targets for countries to become net zero by the published date.
Just to add to that, so Uptime Institute has been tracking over 120 pieces of legislation, voluntary codes, frameworks that are either directly or have some impact on data centers. Of those 120, we've basically identified around 60 of those regulations and reporting requirements that are going to impact both the enterprise sector as well as the service provider sector. It's a highly complex environment, and it's a fast-moving environment. And certainly what we're seeing is the level of understanding by governments who are building the regulatory frameworks is patchy on a global basis. So certainly there needs to be some harmonization on a global level, and there needs to be some level of attribution in terms of the scale of an organization and the geographical location of an organization as far as the sustainability reporting requirements are concerned.
The EU Environmental Directive, it's quite specific in terms of how they like to see the 4 pillars being reported in terms of energy, emission, waste, and water. More importantly, I think for any disclosure from the framework perspective is really telling the truth and the facts of where you are today and what is basically the trajectory that each of the company or the leaders in this organization leading the sustainability or the ESG effort to be able to disclose how you're going to get there. The answer is actually not to be 100%, but more factfully, what it is that is really relevant to your business that you think you need to disclose that will be compliant with the environment and the best practices that your firm decide. I still stick to something that I've been working on as a data center advisor for the UN SDG goal, that is a wonderful blueprint out of the 17 goal. There may be a few of them more relevant to you and your industry. If it is related to the data center, I've written white paper and I've worked with the hyperscaler to chart the journey. So feel free to leverage that and don't pioneer on our pain of what we have done. So there's quite a bit of reporting already there. I will absolutely take up Ali's advice with his esteemed organization for everything that he does every day for our industry. So thank you for that. absolutely leverage that resource. But there's quite a bit of other resource that in the data center journey. So there's no point of starting from scratch. There's quite a bit of reporting already take place, and we can work to collaborate on improving the reporting. It is geographic specific. And one of the shocking news that I have identified is you cannot hide your reporting at the group level anymore. You need to be at the individual basis. I think that is one thing that is a shock awakening for most of the company, that they cannot just group all the resources and then the disclosure at the group level. So be prepared for that. And you do not want to be surprised that the individual business unit now need to disclose their own ESG. And that is very important to actually make that mind shift and the reporting shift.
Susanna, thank you. I'm going to move on quite quickly because time is starting to get against us. And Stephen, I'll give you the first word on this question. You can't go anywhere without there being an AI angle to any discussion at the moment. It's physically impossible to avoid it. Do we think that AI engines can drive down water and energy consumption, or are there other opportunities that AI could bring into the picture that we might not have explored yet? Stephen, I'll give you the first word.
Ooh, finally, the AI topic, of course, I got to get there. But this is, of course, exciting. I think an undercurrent in this discussion has been our responsibility to start looking more and more at the IT load, that kind of denominator in the PUE number. And there's no better example of that than AI in terms of how it's going to change our architecture, what that's going to do to workloads, how we can optimize our IT environment. I mean, in short, will AI directly drive down water and energy consumption by serving workloads in a different way? I'm not immediately optimistic on that in the short term. I mean, there's research from University of Colorado, Riverside, that showed that, or contended that ChatGPT, for example, consumed 700,000 liters of water to train, and a single conversation is like pouring out a half liter of water based on the compute behind that. You know, researchers at MIT showed that training one model of AI releases 5 times the lifetime of emissions of a vehicle, for example. Now, all of that we should take with a grain of caution, a grain of salt, if you will. You know, there's no one size fits all. To be able to understand that with some level of specificity is really important, because I think one message as an industry we need to keep emphasizing is that digitalization can help us drive down emissions, full stop. Digitalizing industries that aren't digitalized today or electrified, and being able to go to this bi-directional grid, that's going to require a lot of compute. And so that's the connection that we need to make is, yes, it's directly increasing impact, but downstream, are we mitigating carbon? Whether it's through Zoom calls like this, not traveling, or we start talking about real-time grid optimization and electrifying processes that we couldn't without digital. So there's this connection that's not super clear, but in the short term, the emergence of AI is happening. It's going to impact how we build, design, think about data centers, and it may open up the opportunity to introduce new technologies like liquid cooling that will be efficient for the first time and help us mitigate some of the biggest effects in terms of the energy consumption of AI.
I'll share one short statement. Get comfortable with the uncomfortable. The computation power and artificial intelligence system is here to stay. It can offer a significant breakthrough in terms of computation resources that needed to train or run a machine learning system. We have seen the growth of just ChatGPT from 1 million queries in 6 weeks to achieving in 2 weeks to 10 minutes. It has significant implications in terms of there's a market for it and people are enjoying the query of doing so. And this is just text to query. And there are other aspects of it in AI. I personally have been working on it from an energy efficiency specific in terms of optimizing energy usage for data center. But Stephen is absolutely correct. There's room for us to improve just even the ChatGPT query, because it's just astounding of how much resources those systems use. So there's definitely improvement. We have been working with the company and they take steps on optimizing it. At the moment right now, they're kind of solving one linear axis in terms of supporting the growth, but they also need to be more efficient. So there's some intersectionality point that they're working on. But indeed, actually computation systems is here to stay for us to do some of the key things that we human, it's just impossible to be able to accomplish.
David, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, Stephen makes some really, really good points previously. I think the thing with it, ultimately, when you look at it purely from a data center perspective, we have controls in place now, and there's an element of machine control where it's monitoring feedback from sensors and adjusting the way it performs accordingly. So it's not a huge step away from that, but ultimately the sites are controlled by the people that are running the buildings. I think where there's more benefit is around things like grid balancing, as Stephen mentioned. But Susanna's absolutely right. It's here. The genie is out of the bottle, and it's never going back in. There is definitely opportunity to improve with assistance from AI. But I know at the moment, if I was talking to my own customer base, I think they'd be quite reluctant if I was kind of saying, okay guys, there you go, we're now going to leave the machines to run the building completely, and we're just going to stand and observe. So they still want ultimately a level of control involved, but there's absolutely opportunity to use the functionality that's there. But I think, as Stephen does, it's probably more around balancing with the grid than the actual day-to-day workings of a data center.
Ali.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that the panelists say. We regard AI as a emergent technology in the data center. So it's by no means a intensely used technology. It's part of the problem of increased capacity that is going to be required to support these AI systems globally. But they can help drive efficiencies in terms of how the data center is operated. And certainly, again, most of our organizations we talk to are not prepared to let AI take control of the infrastructure today. Because, again, as I mentioned earlier, the sector itself relies on tried and tested technology, which has been used by the sector. So over time, we will see AI help in decision making in terms of the design of the data center and the operations of the data center. Whether it will take full control is a decade or so away.
We've only got around 5 minutes left on our panel, so I'm just going to come to one last point, and that's about collaboration. And if the answers on this could be relatively punchy, I would appreciate it. Or we cut into the networking break, and people give you hell if you cut into the networking break. I say that from experience. Looking to the future, there's all of these challenges. How crucial is it that all the stakeholders work together to find those solutions quicker and find better solutions? And I'll start with you, Ali, on this one.
One word: imperative. Maybe a few more words. As we know, we are an ecosystem of suppliers, users, customers, and we need to work together in order to be able to identify the most efficient way of coming up with solutions to the sustainability challenge.
Stephen?
Absolutely imperative. I'll agree 100%. I mean, we are emerging as a major construction subsegment. We are a major part to play in the interconnected grid. So unless we as an ecosystem all get together and collaborate, even panels like this, being able to talk from different parts of the industry, that's what it's going to take to actually meet the requirements of our industry going forward.
And for David, I'll just extend the question slightly, because I'm sure you're going to agree it's important. But how do we actually go about doing that? Yes, panels such as this, but how can we go about fostering that spirit of communication and collaboration?
I think we're all aiming at the same goal, whether we're a customer, a supplier, a manufacturer. There's some good examples already for things like performance metrics. There are so many different ones that are used to assess data centers, but there isn't a common one. Power usage effectiveness is about the efficiency of the building. There's GEC, how much green energy you're using, how much energy reuse. But all of these things really focus on an individual aspect of the data center performance rather than a metric that could be applied to all data centers. Not all data centers use water, for example, so WUE wouldn't be relevant there. I think the other end of this is, and Susanna made a very good point earlier, touched on this, we can build and operate the most efficient data centers in the world, but everybody's got to come on board with that, because if a customer's then going to deploy equipment in the data center and not use it to its full capacity, then there's an element of efficiency that's being massively lost if you've got servers sat there with very low utilization. So it's about talking to, being open with customers, being open with government, getting the regulations right, getting the incentives right for all of us to work together, because we all want the same thing. But it's only going to happen if everybody contributes. Nobody can do it in isolation.
Okay, and we'll take one final contribution, Susanna. If you just want to extend on that, how do we actually realise that spirit of collaboration?
Well, we have one specific directive that the industry already started with all the different hyperscaler come together, which is basically the Embodied Carbon Initiative in terms of transitioning to zero carbon material. Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Meta all have come together of already identifying how to change the construction and the sustainability practices to really reduce emission. I am very encouraged to actually be part of it and learn from these hyperscaler, in addition as being an academia on sharing the different research. So that is one example that we all have come together at the beginning on identifying what I call a sustainability advantage. Truly, we are better together. Truly, we can be measured ourselves that we can go farther together. Sustainability is not an area to gain competitive advantage. It is for us to move the industry forward to accomplish what we're trying to do together. And we like to continue that effort. You can still invent inside your fence. Go at it. You know, that is something that we all are good at doing for the decades. But going forward in terms of achieving carbon neutrality to help the head of state level, we must work together. That is the only way of success.
Absolutely, Susanna, thank you. And I think there was a couple of quotes of the day in there about it not being a place to gain a competitive advantage. So I might put that on a mug and send it to you. Watch this space. Thank you all so much for your time. It's been fascinating. We could continue all afternoon, but we do have a networking break to get to. Thank you all for joining us here at Data Centre Live London.
Thank you.
Thank you
for
very
having
much.
us.